please, I just need somewhere to sit." A coffee cup shattered across the diner floor as a limping old man grabbed the edge of a Hells Angels biker's table and nearly collapsed. His wrists were wrapped in fresh bruises, purple, deep, and ugly. His eyes weren't confused. They were terrified. 7 tables had already turned him away. 7 human beings looked at a trembling, 74-year-old man and chose to look the other direction. Now he was standing at the last table in the room, staring at a broad-shouldered blonde biker who the whole town feared and whispering words nobody expected, "Can I sit with you?" The entire diner went silent. What nobody in that room understood yet was that this old man wasn't running from a stranger. He was running from his own grandson. And the secret he was carrying would soon shake an entire Arizona town to its core. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. Stay with me all the way to the end because this one will stay with you long after it's over. The Arizona heat in mid-July is not something you adapt to. You endure it. You survive it. And on the afternoon that Walter Hayes walked through the front door of Cactus Creek Diner on Route 89, the temperature outside had already climbed past 104 degrees. The air inside the diner was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon. Ceiling fans worked overhead without conviction. Country music played low from somewhere near the kitchen. It was the kind of afternoon where nobody wanted to be bothered and nobody expected anything unusual to happen. Walter Hayes pushed through that door and immediately the room changed. Not dramatically, not with a crash or a shout. It changed the way a room changes when something is quietly deeply wrong, a collective awareness that spreads from table to table like a slow current. Heads turned, eyes moved, conversations dropped half a sentence before they were finished. Walter was 74 years old. He was a tall man once you could tell by the frame of him, but time and something else, something heavier than age had carved him down. His shoulders curved inward. His left leg dragged slightly with every step, giving him a gait that made each movement look like an act of determination. His shirt was a faded blue button-down, the kind a man wears to church or to doctor's appointments, but it hung loose on him in a way that suggested recent weight loss. His gray slacks were clean but wrinkled, as though they had been slept in. His white hair was uncombed. His face carried bruising along the right jawline, yellowed at the edges, meaning it wasn't new, but not old enough to be forgotten either. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, breathing. His eyes moved across the room with a focus that surprised people later when they tried to describe him. Because most of the people in that diner assumed in that first glance that they were looking at a confused elderly man. Maybe someone with dementia who'd wandered off. Maybe someone in the early fog of a medical episode. That's what the mind reaches for when it doesn't want to confront harder possibilities. But Walter Hayes was not confused. His eyes moved across that room the way a man's eyes move when he is calculating, when he is afraid and trying not to show it, when he has already decided something and is simply looking for where to begin. He started toward the nearest table. A couple in their 30s sat there, a woman with a ponytail, a man in a polo shirt, 2 half-eaten plates of eggs between them. Walter stopped beside their table and put one hand on the back of an empty chair. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like someone who hadn't spoken to another person in a while. "Would it be all right if I sat here just for a few minutes? I need to rest my leg." The woman looked at the man. The man looked at the woman. Then the man looked back at Walter with the particular expression that people use when they have decided to be unhelpful, but want to appear regretful about it. "Sorry," the man said. "We're actually expecting someone." Walter looked at the 2 empty chairs across from them. He looked at the door. Nobody was coming through it. Then he looked out at the man and simply nodded once slowly until it moved on. He asked at the next table, a pair of older women, maybe his own age, who were deep in conversation. One of them glanced up and said very quickly, "We're just leaving." They didn't leave. They turned back to each other and lowered their voices. He asked at the booth by the window, a young couple with a baby in a carrier. The woman shook her head without making eye contact. "Sorry, we've got a stroller coming in," he asked at the counter. The man on the stool closest to him shifted his body slightly, angling away, creating a physical message that needed no words. A waitress in her 50s named Donna watched all of this from behind the counter. She told investigators later that she had seen Walter come in, had watched him move from table to table, and had felt something pull at her chest that she couldn't name. She told herself she would help him in a moment. She was in the middle of something. She would help him in just a moment. She didn't. She carried that with her for a long time afterward. Walter asked at 4 more tables. The responses varied in their specific phrasing, but were identical in their meaning. No, not here, not you. Move along. 7 tables, 7 people, 7 chances. And then Walter Hayes was standing at the last occupied table in Cactus Creek Diner, and the people sitting at it were not the kind of people you approach without thinking carefully first. There were 6 of them. Big men, leather vests with patches that told stories to anyone who knew how to read them. Boots, beards, tattoos that ran from wrists to collarbones. They had pushed 2 tables together and spread themselves across them with the casual ownership of men who are accustomed to taking up space without apology. They had ordered a great deal of food and were working through it without much conversation the way men eat when they've spent a long morning doing something physical. The man at the head of the table, if a pushed-together rectangle of diner tables can be said to have a head, was Blake Mercer. Blake was 43 years old. He was built like a man who had done hard physical work his entire life, broad through the shoulders, thick through the chest, with hands that looked like they had been made for gripping things. His hair was blonde, going gray at the temples. His beard was full and kept. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw from an incident years back that he didn't discuss in mixed company. Around Arizona, in certain circles, the name Blake Mercer carried weight. Not the kind of weight that comes from a reputation for violence exactly, but the kind that comes from a reputation for being absolutely uncompromisingly serious about whatever he put his attention on. Blake was a chapter president. He had been writing for 22 years. He had buried brothers. He had fought battles legal and otherwise. He had a daughter in college in Tucson who he called every Sunday evening without fail and who called him daddy without the slightest embarrassment, even at 20 years old. None of that was visible at first glance. What was visible was sized leather patches and the kind of stillness that very confident men carry. Walter stopped beside their table. He stood there for a moment, and the table noticed him one by one, the way tables of men notice things peripheral first, then direct. The conversation stopped. Forks paused over plates. One of the younger men, a wiry redhead named Cage, watched Walter with open curiosity. Blake looked up last. Walter looked directly at him, not past him, not at the group generally, at him specifically, because Walter Hayes, who had spent the last 2 years learning to read the difference between people who might help and people who would not, had already made his assessment. "Can I sit with you?" Walter asked. "Please." The diner, which had been humming with ambient noise a moment before, went quiet enough that the ceiling fan became audible. Blake studied Walter for 2 full seconds. His eyes moved not the way people's eyes move when they are deciding whether to be kind, but the way they move when they are reading something, taking in information. He looked at Walter's face. He looked at Walter's hands. He looked at the way Walter was standing, the weight distribution, the slight forward lean, the way his left hand gripped the back of a chair, not quite at the table, but close enough to use it for support. Then Blake reached out and pulled the empty chair beside him away from the table. "Sit down," Blake said. It was not a warm invitation. It was not a cold one. It was simply a fact delivered as a fact. "There is a chair. You need to sit. Sit." Walter sat. The noise in the diner came back slowly, like water filling a space. But it was different now. Quieter at the edges. People were watching without appearing to watch. The man in the polo shirt, who had claimed to be expecting company, had turned slightly in his seat. Donna, the waitress, came over faster than she had moved all afternoon. "Can I get you something, hun?" she asked Walter, and her voice had changed to softer now, carrying a quality of apology that she didn't put into words. "Coffee," Walter said, "and whatever the breakfast plate is, if that's all right." "Of course it's all right," Donna said and wrote it down. For a moment, nobody at the table spoke. Blake continued eating. The other men followed his lead. Walter sat with both hands wrapped around the coffee cup Donna brought quickly before his food, and he stared at the surface of the dark liquid as though it were the first familiar thing he'd encountered in a long time. Cage the redhead was watching Walter with an expression that was more open than the others. He was 26, the youngest at the table by a decade, and he had not yet learned the particular skill of maintaining a neutral face when something was pulling at his attention. "You okay, man?" Cage asked. The question was casual, the way you ask it when you don't really expect a complicated answer. Walter looked up. "No," he said. "I'm not." Cage glanced at Blake. Blake had set his fork down. "Your food's coming," Blake said to Walter. His voice was level. "Take your time." Walter looked at his hands. He turned them over on the table slowly so the undersides of his wrists were visible. The bruising there was different from what showed on his face. The bruising on his wrists was circular, patterned, the kind that comes from restraint, from something being tied or locked, from skin pressing against a hard edge over and over across a long period of time. Blake looked at Walter's wrist for a long moment. Then he looked at Walter's face. "Who did that to you?" Blake asked quietly. The table had gone very still. Walter took a breath. He let it out slowly. He looked at the table surface, then at the window, then back at his coffee cup. And then he began to talk. He didn't start at the beginning. People who have been through something enormous rarely do. They start where the weight is heaviest and work outward from there. "My grandson put me in a shed," Walter said. The words came out flat without drama, which somehow made them worse. Cage made a sound, just a small one, like someone had pressed something against a bruise unexpectedly. "His name is Tyler," Walter continued. "Tyler Hayes. He's my daughter Karen's boy. Karen passed 4 years ago, cancer. After that, Tyler came to stay with me. He said he wanted to help. He was very—" Walter paused. His mouth working slightly around a word he seemed to be tasting for accuracy. He was very convincing. "How long have you been in this shed?" Blake asked. "The shed came later," Walter said. "The shed started about 8 months ago. Before that, it was just the house, just not being able to leave, not being able to call anyone." Blake picked up his coffee cup, set it back down without drinking. "Where's the shed?" "My property," Walter said, "on Ridgeline Road, about 14 miles from here." "How'd you get here today?" For the first time since sitting down, something moved across Walter's face that might have been the distant relative of a smile. Rueful, exhausted. "Tyler took me to get a blood draw this morning at the clinic on Fort Valley Road. He does that every couple months. Has a doctor there who—" Walter stopped, started again. "The doctor says what Tyler pays him to say. But Tyler had to park around back because the lot was full, and when he went around back, I just walked. I walked as fast as I could, and I didn't stop." "That's how you got the coffee here," Donna said, and the table all looked up because none of them had noticed her standing close by. Her face had gone pale. Her order pad was in her hand, but she'd stopped writing anything. "You walked 14 miles. "I didn't walk the whole way," Walter said. "A woman stopped and gave me a ride for about 8 miles. She didn't ask questions. I was grateful for that." The table was quiet. Blake had turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the tabletop twice. It was a small, controlled motion that people who knew him understood as the external signal of internal processing. He was not a man who reacted. He was a man who assessed and then moved. And right now he was assessing everything Walter Hayes had just told him against the physical evidence sitting across the table, the bruises, the loose clothes, the careful, measured way the old man spoke like someone who had learned to make each word count because words had been taken from him. "You said he convinced people you have dementia," Blake said. "Yes. You don't." "No," Walter said, "I do not." "How'd he convince them?" Walter was quiet for a moment. Donna had brought his food, eggs, toast, bacon, hash browns, and he looked at it with an expression that was hard to read, like he'd forgotten what it was to have a plate put in front of him that he could eat freely. "He's very good at it," Walter said finally. He's intelligent. He's charming. He can walk into a room and make every person in it feel like the most important person he's spoken to all week. That's a real skill. I used to admire it in him when he was younger." Walter picked up his fork. His hand was trembling slightly. "He started telling people I was confused. Small things at first. Grandpa forgot where he put his keys again. Grandpa thought it was Tuesday when it was Thursday. People believe what a loving grandson tells them about his grandfather's mind. Why wouldn't they? He cried the first time he told our neighbor Donna different. Donna sorry that he was worried about me. Real tears. I watched him do it through the window." Blake said nothing. "He found a doctor." Walter continued eating slowly, deliberately, as though his body was reminding him that it needed fuel and he was only partially listening. "Dr. Raymond Ashford, clinic on Fort Valley. Ashford wrote a cognitive assessment that said I was in moderate decline. recommended restricted independence. Tyler had himself designated as my primary caregiver within about 3 months of coming to stay. And nobody questioned it, said a man named Decker who sat 2 seats down from Blake. Decker was 51, heavy-set with a gray beard and eyes that missed very little. He had not spoken until now. People questioned it, Walter said. My friend Gerald questioned it, came to the house twice. Tyler told him I was having a bad day and couldn't have visitors. Gerald called the county twice. They sent a social worker once. Tyler spent 40 minutes with her in the kitchen before she came to see me. Whatever he said in that kitchen, she was already decided before she knocked on my door. Walter set his fork down and looked at Decker directly. When you've already decided a man is confused, everything he says becomes evidence of confusion. I told that social worker Tyler was stealing from me. She wrote in her report that I was experiencing paranoid ideation. The silence at the table had a texture to it now. Blake was looking at Walter's wrists again. The old man had turned them back over, but the memory of what Blake had seen sat in the air between them. The notebooks, Walter said suddenly as though he'd remembered something. He reached into his shirt pocket, an inside pocket, the kind of shirt pocket most people don't know exists, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was soft at the folds the way paper gets when it's been handled many times. He unfolded it on the table carefully. It was covered in small, dense, absolutely precise handwriting. I kept records, Walter said. Dates, amounts, what he said, what he did. I kept them hidden inside a loose board in the floor of the shed. This is just one page. There are 23 more in that shed. He never found them because he didn't think I was smart enough to hide something. Blake reached out and looked at the paper without touching it. His eyes moved down the column of dates and entries, quickly, then slowly, then quickly again. He looked up at Walter. Is this written in your hand? When Blake asked. Entirely, Walter said, because a man with dementia doesn't write like this. No, Walter said. He doesn't. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but recognition. The particular recognition that passes between two people when one of them has been unseen for a longer time and the other one is in fact seeing them. Cage had been leaning forward over the table without realizing it. He sat back now and rubbed his face with one hand. Man, he said quietly. It wasn't a coherent response to anything. It was just the sound of someone's chest tightening. Walter, Blake said, the first time he'd used the old man's name. Do you have any family? Anyone other than Tyler? My brother lives in New Mexico. We haven't spoken in 3 years. Tyler managed that too. Walter folded the paper back up carefully and returned it to his inside pocket. My wife Eleanor passed 6 years ago. She was the one people listened to. She had a way of making things clear. He paused. I miss her in a specific way now. Not just because she was my wife, because she would have seen Tyler from the very beginning. She would have known in the first 10 minutes what he was. What is he? Cage asked. Walter looked at the young man across the table. His voice when he answered was not angry. It was something quieter than anger, and therefore more frightening. He's a man who decided that I was worth more to him converted into money than I was as a person, Walter said. And he was patient enough to spend 2 years making sure everybody who might have argued otherwise was either convinced I was crazy or convinced I was lucky to have him. The diner had never fully recovered its pre-Walter noise level. Around them, conversations continued, but lower, more careful. Donna had stopped even pretending to do anything else. She stood at the end of the counter with her hand over her mouth. Blake sat back in his chair. He looked at this man, 74 years old. Bruised wrists, carefully folded evidence in his shirt pocket, eating his eggs with the deliberate focus of someone who had not been allowed to choose his own meals in a long time, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to the man on his right, a quiet man named Russ, who people often forgot was at a table until something needed to be done, at which point they remembered him immediately. Call Hal, done, Blake said. Tell him we need the van and we need him at Ridgeline Road. Don't say anything else on the phone. Russ nodded and slid out of his seat without a word. Blake turned back to Walter. Finish your food, Blake said, and then I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Walter looked at him. His hands, still trembling slightly, were wrapped around his coffee cup again. Why? Walter asked. Not suspiciously, genuinely. Like a man who had been disappointed enough times that he needed to understand the reason before he let himself believe in it. Blake met his eyes. Because you walked 14 miles in 104-degree heat with a bad leg to find somebody who would listen, Blake said. And you sat down at the one table where everybody already thinks we're trouble, which means you already figured out that the people the world trusts most are the ones who earned your worst nightmare. He paused. You picked the right table, Walter. Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back down at his food. And when he picked up his fork again, his hand was a little steadier than before. Outside, Route 89 shimmered in the heat. 14 miles away on a property on Ridgeline Road, a shed stood locked in the afternoon sun. Inside it, a cot, canned food stacked in a corner, a loose board in the floor, and 23 pages of the most carefully organized, precisely documented, quietly devastating evidence that anyone in that courtroom months later would say they had ever seen. Walter Hayes had not escaped. He had arrived. And the moment he sat down at Blake Mercer's table, something that had been stopped for 2 years began very slowly to move again. Walter finished his eggs in silence, and Blake let him. That was the first thing Walter noticed about Blake Mercer. The man understood the difference between silence that pressures and silence that waits. 2 years of Tyler's particular brand of control had made Walter acutely sensitive to that distinction. Tyler's silences always wanted something. They were loaded, pointed, designed to make Walter fill them with whatever Tyler needed to hear. Blake's silence was different. It just sat there, steady and patient, like a man who had nowhere else to be and had already decided he wasn't leaving until this conversation was finished. When Walter set his fork down for the last time and pushed the plate slightly away, Blake leaned forward and rested both forearms on the table. "Start from when your wife died," Blake said. Walter looked at him. "Eleanor." "Eleanor," Blake repeated. No impatience. Just the name given back correctly. Walter nodded once and began. Eleanor Hayes had died on a Tuesday in March 6 years ago from congestive heart failure. She had been sick for 2 years before that, and Walter had cared for her the entire time without complaint and without asking for help, because that was the kind of man he was and the kind of marriage they had. When she died, the house on Ridgeline Road became very quiet in a way that Walter had not anticipated and did not know how to address. He was 68 years old. He had a pension from 31 years working for the County Water Authority. He had a house he owned outright, 2 vehicle savings, and a life insurance policy on Eleanor that paid out a sum he never discussed with anyone except his attorney. He was not rich, but he was not struggling. Tyler Hayes was Karen's son. Karen had been Walter's only daughter, and she had died of ovarian cancer 14 months after Eleanor, which was a grief that Walter had never fully processed because Tyler had arrived at his door almost immediately after Karen's funeral, suitcase in hand, saying that he couldn't stand the thought of his grandfather being alone. He was 29 when he came, Walter said. Healthy, smart, had some college but never finished. He'd been doing odd job sales mostly. He was good at sales. I remember thinking that first month that Karen would have been glad he was there. He cooked, he fixed the gutters, he drove me to appointments without being asked. He called me Grandpa Walt in a way that... Walter paused, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, in a way that sounded like he meant it. When did it change? Decker asked. Slowly, Walter said, which is the whole point. If it had changed all at once, I would have seen it. Tyler knew that. I think he always knew that. Walter's voice was steady, but there was something moving underneath it, the way a current moves under ice. You can't see it directly, but you feel the instability. The first thing was the phone. He said, my plan was outdated, offered to upgrade it. I let him. The new phone had a password I didn't know and a plan I couldn't access independently. He said he'd set it up so I wouldn't have to deal with the technical parts. Cage made a sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't, and you believed him. I was 68, my wife was gone, my daughter was gone, and my grandson was standing in my kitchen telling me he wanted to help me. Walter looked at Cage directly. Yes, I believed him. Wouldn't you? Cage had the good grace to drop his eyes. Yeah, he said quietly. I would. The bank cards came next, Walter continued. He said he'd seen a news story about elderly fraud. Said he wanted to monitor the accounts for suspicious activity. He set up online access, and I didn't object because that's what you do when someone says they're protecting you. You let them. Walter's hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup. Within 4 months, Tyler had access to every account, every card. The passwords had all been reset to things I didn't know. When I asked about them, he would say he'd written them down somewhere, and he'd find the paper. He never found the paper. Blake said nothing. He was listening with his whole body, not just his ears, but his posture, his stillness. The driver's license, Walter said. That one he was clever about. He told me my license was due for renewal and offered to take me to the DMV. We went. But instead of a renewal, he had arranged, I still don't know entirely how, for a medical evaluation flag on my record. A form that said I had been referred for cognitive assessment before renewal could be processed. After that day, he told me the DM5 had decided my license was under review. He drove me everywhere from that point. I had no independent transportation. He cut every exit, Decker said. One at a time, Walter said. So none of them felt like a door closing. Each one felt like someone helping. Blake turned his head slightly toward Russ, who had come back to the table silently, sometime in the middle of Walter's account, and resumed his seat. Blake raised one eyebrow. Russ gave the smallest possible nod. The van was handled. Hal was coming. Tell me about Dr. Ashford, Blake said. Walter's expression shifted. It was the first time since sitting down that something approaching cold anger showed on his face. And it looked entirely natural there, the way a certain kind of expression looks when it belongs to a person rather than being performed. Ashford, Walter said. Raymond Ashford, Fort Valley Medical Clinic. He's 61 years old. He's been in practice for 30 years. He has an office with degrees on the wall and a very firm handshake, and he looked me in the eye and told me I was showing significant cognitive decline when I was not. Walter said it evenly without raising his voice, which somehow made it more devastating. He ran a test on me, asked me what year it was, who the president was to count backward by sevens from 100. I answered every question correctly. He wrote in my file that I had struggled with all of them. The table went completely still. You're telling me he just lied, Cage said. A licensed doctor. Just lied. Tyler paid him, Walter said simply. I don't know exactly how much, but I know it was ongoing, monthly, because I found the payment records. That's in the notebooks. Blake leaned back in his chair slowly. He looked at Walter Hayes, this 74-year-old man with bruised wrists and precisely handwritten documentation folded in his shirt pocket, and for just a moment, something crossed Blake Mercer's face that was not calculation, not assessment, not leadership. It was pure, uncomplicated fury. It moved across his features quickly and was controlled quickly, but Cage saw it, and Decker saw it, and Walter saw it. Walter, for the first time, exhaled fully. The shed, Blake said. His voice had dropped in register. Not louder, quieter, actually. The kind of quiet that carries weight. Tell me how that started. Walter set his coffee cup down and looked at it. 8 months ago, Tyler had started having guests, people I didn't know, men he called business associates. They would come to the house in the evenings and Tyler would want me out of the way. First, he would just ask me to stay in my room. Then he put a lock on my door from the outside. Then he started locking me in the backyard. And then Walter stopped. He picked up his cup again, even though it was empty. He held it the way people hold things when they need something to hold. There was an old storage shed in the back. It had been my workshop before my hands got bad. Eleanor used to grow tomatoes along the south wall. He paused. Tyler cleaned it out, put in a cot, a portable toilet, a shelf of canned food, and a manual can opener. He put a padlock on the door. Nobody at the table spoke. He told the neighbors he'd built me a guest suite because I'd started wandering at night. That was the story. For the health and safety of a man with dementia, his devoted grandson had created a safe, contained space. Walter's voice had not broken. It was more frightening that it hadn't. Some of them probably believed it. Some of them probably didn't want to think too hard about it. Decker stood up abruptly, walked 3 steps away from the table, stood with his back to the group for a moment, then came back and sat down. Nobody commented on this. It was the most honest physical response anyone in the diner had shown, and Walter watched it happen with something in his eyes that was almost gratitude. The notebooks, Blake said, returning to the center of it. You said 23 pages in the shed, under the floorboard, third from the left, near the east wall. I used a loose nail to mark it. Walter reached back into his shirt pocket and touched the single folded page. I carried this one on me today, in case I didn't get another chance to talk to someone, in case he didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. What's in them? Blake asked. All of it. Dates and amounts for every financial transaction I could identify from the statements I saw before he locked me out of the accounts entirely. $17,000 in the first year. I believe it's considerably more now. Documentation of the visits from the social worker, word for word, what she said, what I said. Documentation of each time Tyler brought Ashford to the house for what he called wellness checks. Documentation of the names of the business associates who came to visit. I have 6 names. I have physical descriptions for 4 others. Blake picked up his phone from the table. I'm going to make a call, he said. Her name is Sandra Voss. She's an attorney. She doesn't do criminal work, but she knows people who do, and she owes me a conversation. He looked at Walter steadily. Are you okay with that? Walter looked back at him. Is she honest? Brutally, Fahim, Blake said. I've been on the wrong side of her twice. Both times she was right. For the second time, something moved across Walter's face that was in the family of a smile. Then yes, he said. I'm okay with that. Blake stepped away from the table. The remaining men sat with Walter in a silence that had changed quality entirely. It was no longer the silence of strangers assessing each other. It was the silence of people who have heard something and are processing what it requires of them. Cage leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Walter, he said, can I ask you something? Yes. Why the bikers? Cage asked. And his voice was genuine, not challenging, not joking, genuinely curious. You walked past a table of what looked like normal families, a couple with a baby, a table of women your own age. Why'd you come to us? Walter was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he looked at Cage with the level eyes of a man who had spent 2 years studying people from the inside of a locked room. Because Tyler taught me something, Walter said. He taught me that the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who look the safest, the ones everybody trusts without question, the doctors with degrees on the wall, the devoted grandsons who cry real tears. He paused. I figured the people who'd already been told they were the scary ones had less reason to perform, less reason to pretend. Another pause. I was looking for someone who was already what they appeared to be. Cage stared at him. That's the smartest thing anybody said to me in a year, Cage said. Blake came back to the table phone in his jacket pocket, expression arranged and purposeful. Sandra's making calls. She's got a contact at the county DA's office, not a friend of professional contact, which is better. And she knows a judge who takes elder abuse cases personally. He sat down. But here's what we need to do first, and we need to do it before Tyler realizes you're gone and does anything to that shed or those notebooks. He'll know I'm gone by now, Walter said. The calm in his voice was almost frightening. The blood draw appointment was at noon. It's past 3. He'll have called the clinic. When they say I left on foot, Walter stopped. His jaw worked. He'll be moving things. He's very organized when he's panicking. I've seen it. Then we move now, Blake said. He looked around the table. Cage Decker, Russ, you're with me. Hatch and Fierro, you stay here with Walter until Sandra arrives. He looked at Walter directly. We're going to Ridgeline Road. We're going to document what's in that shed before he gets to it. And we're not going to touch anything except to photograph it. You can't just, Walter started. I know what I can and can't do, Blake said. Not unkindly, firmly. The property is yours. Your name is on the deed. Yes. Then you can authorize someone to enter on your behalf. Blake held up his phone. I need you to say it clearly into this, that you are Walter Hayes, that you own the property at what's the address? 4417 Ridgeline Road, Walter said. That you own the property at 4417 Ridgeline Road, that you are of sound mind and full cognitive capacity, and that you authorize Blake Mercer to enter the property and its outbuildings to document conditions for the purpose of legal proceedings. Can you do that? Walter looked at him. The question sat in the air for just a moment. Press record, Walter said. Blake pressed record. Walter Hayes looked into the phone camera with the steady, clear, absolutely deliberate eyes of a man who had been waiting 2 years for exactly this moment, and he spoke every word exactly as Blake had outlined them, in a voice that did not shake, that did not waver, that carried in it 31 years of county, work, and 68 years of a man simply being who he was. When he finished, Blake stopped the recording. Sandra's getting a copy of that in 30 seconds, Blake said, already typing. One more thing, Walter said. Blake looked up. In the shed, under the same board as the notebooks, there's a small tin box. Red. It was Eleanor's. Tyler doesn't know it's there. Inside is her wedding ring. She gave it to me just before she died. Said she wanted me to keep it safe. Walter's voice did not break here either, but something changed in the air pressure around the table. Please don't leave it there. Blake looked at him for a long moment. I'll carry it myself, Blake said. He stood. The men around him stood. They moved with a kind of coordinated, unhurried efficiency that spoke to years of operating as a unit. Cage was already pulling on his jacket. Decker had his keys in hand. Russ was at the door. Blake paused beside Walter's chair. Hatch and Fierro won't leave your side, he said. Sandra should be here within the hour. Don't talk to anyone else, no police, no county officials, nobody until she's sitting next to you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because every word you say from this moment forward is evidence and needs to be said correctly. Walter nodded. Blake, Walter said. Blake stopped. Why are you doing this? Walter asked. The same question he'd asked before, but different now. Less fundamental, more specific. Not why would anyone help, but why these men this afternoon. Blake stood there for a moment. He wasn't a man who performed emotion. He wasn't a man who made speeches. But he looked at Walter Hayes, bruised, careful, alone, and still somehow absolutely unbroken, and he said what he said. I had a father, Blake said. Good man, worked hard his whole life. When he got old, nobody came, nobody showed up. He paused. Somebody should have. He walked out. Hatch and Fierro, a quiet, heavy-set man, and a tall man with a graying ponytail pulled their chairs closer to Walter without fanfare. Hatch refilled Walter's coffee from the pot Donna had left nearby. Fierro looked out the window toward the parking lot where they'd watched Blake's truck pull out, followed by two bikes. Walter held his cup and said nothing. 14 miles away on a property on Ridgeline Road, Tyler Hayes was making phone calls in the backyard. Fast ones. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not, because the clinic had called at 12:40 to ask about Grandpa Walt, and it was now 3:17, and Grandpa Walt had not come back. Tyler walked to the shed, checked the padlock, still locked. He pressed his palm flat against the door for a moment, and then he went back inside the house and his hands got steadier because Tyler Hayes was at his most dangerous when he was afraid and making himself calm. He did not know that 40 minutes later, a van would pull through the front gate of 4417 Ridgeline Road. He did not know that Blake Mercer would stand in front of that shed and take 67 photographs before he opened the floorboard. He did not know about the notebooks or the tin box or the wedding ring. He did not know that a woman named Sandra Voss was already on the phone with an investigator she trusted who specialized in financial elder abuse. And he did not know that 23 handwritten pages in the precise and absolutely lucid handwriting of a 74-year-old man who was very much in possession of his mind were about to become the most important document in an Arizona courtroom. What Tyler Hayes knew in the backyard of 4417 Ridgeline Road was that something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm yet, just the warning. The moment when the world is about to show you what it's been gathering. Back at the diner, Walter Hayes sat between two Hells Angels he had met 40 minutes ago, drinking his third cup of coffee, and for the first time in 8 months, he was sitting in an unlocked room. He was thinking about Eleanor, about her wedding ring in a red tin box under a floorboard, about the way she used to say that the measure of a person was not what they did when things were easy. He was also thinking about the 23 notebooks and wondering if 23 pages would be enough. He didn't know yet. But Sandra Voss, sitting in her car 2 miles from the diner, reading the voice recording Blake had just sent her and cross-referencing a name, Dr. Raymond Ashford, Fort Valley Medical Clinic, against a database she kept professionally and personally, had just found something that made her stop the car completely. Ashford had been flagged before. Not charged, not convicted. Flagged. 2 years ago. Different patient, different caregiver, different county. Same pattern. She sat with that for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Blake. He answered on the first ring. How fast can you get those notebooks out of that shed? Sandra said. Already on my way, Blake said. Good, Sandra said, because this is bigger than Walter. Sandra Voss said 4 words and then the line was quiet for exactly 2 seconds while Blake processed them. Bigger than Walter, Blake repeated. Not a question, a confirmation. The kind a man makes when he suspected something was coming and wanted to hear it said plainly before he started moving toward it. Ashford had a prior flag, Sandra said. She was speaking fast, but precisely the way she always did when something had activated the part of her brain that had made her very good at what she did for 26 years. 2 years ago, Yavapai County, patient named Miriam Cole, 79 years old. Caregiver was a nephew named Dennis Farrow. Farrow brought Ashford in as the evaluating physician. Ashford wrote a cognitive decline assessment. Farrow was designated primary caregiver. Miriam Cole died 14 months later. The estate went entirely to Farrow. She paused. The flag was filed by Miriam's neighbor, who said she didn't believe the dementia diagnosis and thought the nephew was controlling the old woman. Adult Protective Services investigated. Ashford's documentation held up. Case closed. Until now, Blake said. Until now, Sandra said. Because now I have Walter Hayes, who I have on a voice recording, showing complete cognitive clarity, and I have Raymond Ashford having written an assessment saying Walter is in moderate decline, and I have a pattern. Blake, a pattern across patients, across caregivers, with the same physician is not a coincidence. That's a system. Wow. Blake was driving. Through the windshield, Route 89 was moving past fast. Beside him, Cage was listening to one side of a conversation and watching Blake's face to read the other half. Behind them, Decker's bike stayed close. How many more? Blake said. I don't know yet. I have 2 confirmed flags. I need access to medical licensing records and probate court filings to cross-reference Ashford's name. That takes time I'm currently trying to compress. A brief pause. Are you at the property? 5 minutes out. Document everything. I mean everything, the padlock, the door, the cot, the food, the floorboard. I want photographs with timestamps. And Blake, don't move the notebooks out of the shed until I tell you to. They need to be found in place, not transported, or a defense attorney will spend 3 days arguing chain of custody. The tin box, Blake said, a brief silence. What tin box? Walter has a personal item in there, his wife's wedding ring. He asked me to get it. Sandra made a sound that was a conflict between her professional instincts and her human ones. The professional ones almost won. Almost. Photograph it in place first, she said finally. Then you can take it, but the photograph has to exist before it leaves that floorboard. Understood. I'm calling Jim Cavallo at the DA's office in 20 minutes, Sandra said. He's going to want to talk to Walter today. Prepare him. He's prepared, Blake said. He's been preparing for 2 years. He ended the call and looked at Cage. Ashford's done this before, Blake said. Cage absorbed that for 3 seconds. So Tyler found a doctor who already had a system. Or, Blake said, and his voice had gone to a place that was very quiet and very focused. The doctor found Tyler. That landed in the truck cab like something physical. Cage turned it over in his mind and said nothing because there was nothing immediate to say to it that would help. They turned onto Ridgeline Road. The property at 4417 was a single-story house on a generous lot, the kind of house a working man saves for 30 years to own and then keeps carefully for 30 more. Walter had told them the shed was in the back, accessible through a side gate. Blake had the address on his phone's GPS, but he would have found it anyway. There was only one property on this stretch that had a side gate with a new padlock on it that was shinier and heavier than anything else on the fence, the way a lock looks when it was chosen not for security, but for control. They went through the main gate because it was unlocked. No sign of Tyler's vehicle. Blake had not expected one. Tyler was the kind of man who moved when threatened, and he was currently threatened in a direction he didn't know about yet, which meant he was moving in the wrong direction, probably toward the clinic, probably toward Ashford, probably trying to construct a story that would explain Walter's absence in terms that kept his own narrative intact. He had left the shed locked. Blake stood in front of it. The padlock was a commercial-grade master heavy combination style. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at Russ. Russ reached into his jacket and produced a bolt cutter that he had retrieved from the van with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that preparation was just another word for paying attention. He handed it to Blake. Walter authorized entry, Blake said, partly for the record, partly because it mattered to him to say it. He cut the lock. The door swung open. None of them said anything for a moment. The smell hit first enclosed heat, the specific staleness of an unventilated space, something underneath it that was harder to name. Decker turned away for a second and then turned back. Cage stood in the doorway, and his hands had closed into fists at his sides without him deciding to do that. A cot with a thin mattress in one folded blanket, a shelf with canned goods, beans, soup, fruit, cocktail, and a manual opener on a nail, a 5-gallon water container, a portable toilet in the corner, a single overhead light on a pull cord, a small plastic bin with a change of clothes. That was everything. This was where Walter Hayes had been living for 8 months. Blake did not let himself stand there and feel it. Not yet. He pulled out his phone and started photographing systematically door padlock, cutting in place the interior from the doorway, then every section clockwise, then the shelf, the cot, the floor. He photographed the pull cord light that could only be turned on from inside, which meant some small mercy had been in the design or Tyler had wanted to be able to turn it off from outside. Blake photographed both possibilities. Third board from the left, Cage said quietly. He was reading from a note he'd taken at the diner on his own phone. East wall. Blake found the wall, counted boards. The third one had a small scratch mark near the left edge, not a nail, just a scratch, the kind you make with something thin when you need a marker that won't be obvious to someone who isn't looking for it. Blake photographed the board in place. Then he worked the edge up carefully and the board came free. The notebooks were there, 23 pages of folded paper secured with a rubber band that had dried and gone brittle. Blake photographed them in place in the floor before touching them. Then he lifted them out and set them on the cot and photographed each page individually, making sure every line of Walter's small, precise handwriting was legible in the image. It took 11 minutes to photograph all 23 pages. When he was done, Blake stood up and looked at the documentation on his phone screen. Dates going back 22 months. Dollar amounts. Names. Dr. Ashford's name appeared 6 times, a name Blake didn't recognize. Marcus Riley appeared twice with dollar amounts beside it that were larger than the others. The name was circled in pen with a question mark. Blake photographed the circled name separately. Then he reached back into the floorboard and found the red tin box. It was small, maybe 4 inches across. The red had faded on the lid, but was brighter on the sides where it had been sheltered. It had a small latch that wasn't locked. Blake photographed it closed in the floorboard before he touched the latch. Then he opened it. Eleanor Hayes' wedding ring was a simple gold band, thin the kind that had been worn on the same finger for so long it had developed a groove in the metal where it had pressed against the engagement ring beside it. No engagement ring in the box, just the band. Blake picked it up. He held it for a moment in his palm, a whole life compressed into a circle of gold small enough to disappear in his hand. He thought about the man sitting in the diner right now, holding an empty coffee cup, who had hidden this under a floorboard because it was the last thing he had that belonged to the woman he loved, and he had refused to let it be taken. Blake closed his hand around the ring and put it in his jacket's inside pocket. He pulled out his phone and called Sandra. Notebooks documented in place, he said when she picked up. 23 pages. I'm going to tell you a name, and I need you to run it. He looked at the photographed page. Marcus Riley. He appears twice in Walter's notes with significant dollar amounts and a question mark. The silence on Sandra's end lasted 4 seconds, which was long for her. Spell it, she said. He spelled it. Another silence. Longer this time. He could hear the sound of her typing and then stopping and then typing again. Blake, Sandra said, where are you right now? Still in the shed? Step outside. He stepped outside. The afternoon had not cooled. He stood in the yard with the phone to his ear and waited. Marcus Riley is not a business associate, Sandra said. Marcus Riley is a licensed estate planning attorney in Flagstaff. He specializes in trust formation and power of attorney documentation. Blake was very still. Tyler hired an estate attorney, Blake said, 2 years ago, which is almost exactly when he arrived at Walter's house. Sandra's voice had a quality in it that her clients had learned to recognize. Not excitement, not anger, but the particular steadiness of someone who can see the shape of something large and is measuring it carefully. If Riley drafted a power of attorney document giving Tyler legal control over Walter's finances, and if that document was based on Ashford's fraudulent cognitive assessment, then Tyler has had legal access to everything Walter owns for 2 years, Blake said. And every transaction under that power of attorney is potentially fraudulent, Sandra said, because the cognitive assessment that authorized it was fabricated. which means we're not looking at theft. We're looking at fraud, elder abuse, unlawful confinement, and potentially a conspiracy involving a licensed physician and a licensed attorney. Blake said nothing for a moment. How deep does this go, he said. I don't know yet, Sandra said, but Blake Riley's name appeared in Walter's notes. Walter noticed him. Walter wrote it down with a question mark. She paused. That old man was building a case from inside a shed with nothing but a pen and a loose floorboard. I know, Blake said. I've seen his handwriting. I'm calling Cavallo right now. This has graduated. This is not an APS referral anymore. This is a multi-party criminal investigation, and it needs to start moving today. Tyler is going to run, Blake said. It wasn't a prediction. It was an assessment. When he figures out the shed is open and the notebooks are gone, he's going to run. Which is why Cavallo needs to move in the next 2 hours, Sandra said. Get back to Walter. I'll be at the diner in 40 minutes. Blake was already moving. He told Cage and Decker to stay at the property and not let anyone in. He told Russ to stay with the van. He drove back toward the diner alone, and on that 14-mile drive, he thought about what Sandra had just described. A physician, an attorney, and a caregiver operating in coordination across potentially multiple victims, across multiple counties, quietly converting elderly people's lives into money, with a system that looked from the outside exactly like love and care and responsible family behavior. He thought about Miriam Cole in Yavapai County, who had died 14 months after Dennis Farrow became her caregiver, and whose estate had gone entirely to Farrow, and whose neighbor had filed a flag that went nowhere because Ashford's paperwork was clean. He thought about how many names might be in the records he hadn't found yet. And he thought about Walter Hayes, who was 74 years old and had walked 14 miles in 104-degree heat and sat down at a table full of people the world had decided were frightening because he had run out of options that looked safe. Walter was sitting exactly where Blake had left him when Blake walked back through the diner door. Hatch was on his left. Fierro was on his right. The diner had thinned out the afternoon lull, and Donna was wiping the counter nearby, which Blake was fairly certain was not an accident. She had not gone far from Walter's vicinity since the moment the old man sat down. Walter looked at Blake's face when he came in and read it the way a man reads a face when he's had 2 years of practice reading the faces of people entering a room and deciding immediately whether the news was going to be used against him or not. You found something, Walter said. Blake sat down across from him. He reached into his jacket's inside pocket and set the red tin box on the table in front of Walter. Walter looked at it. He put both hands around it without opening it and sat that way for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were clear, but something in them had shifted, some last piece of bracing that a person puts in place when they're not sure the important things have survived. The notebooks, Walter asked. Documented, safe. Blake paused. Walter, the name Marcus Riley. You wrote it in your notes with a question mark. Tell me what you know about him. Walter's expression sharpened. Tyler mentioned him once, said he was helping with some paperwork. Legal paperwork, he called it. Wouldn't say more than that. The amount I wrote down, I found a receipt. Tyler left it on the kitchen counter. I had maybe 40 seconds to read it before Tyler came back in. I memorized it. Walter looked at Blake steadily. Riley is an estate attorney. Yes, Blake said. Tyler had him draft a power of attorney document. Yes, using Ashford's assessment as the basis. Yes, Blake paused. You already knew. I suspected, Walter said. I couldn't prove it from inside a shed. He looked at the tin box under his hands. Is there more? Ashford flagged on a prior case, Blake said. Different patient, same pattern. The woman died. Estate went to the caregiver. Walter absorbed this. His face did not collapse. It did what faces do when a person receives information that confirms the very worst thing they already understood. It went still, and something in the eyes took on a particular weight. He killed her, Walter said. We don't know that yet. He created the conditions that killed her, Walter said, which is the same thing with a longer timeline. He looked at Blake. How many others? We're working on that now. I need to know, Walter said, and his voice had something in it that was different from anything Blake had heard from him, yet not fear, not exhaustion, not the careful, measured cadence of a man who had trained himself to speak precisely in case each word was evidence. This was something harder and older. This was the voice of a man who has realized that his own suffering was not unique and that realization has transformed his purpose. I need to know because if there are others and they're alive, then what happens in the next few hours matters for more than just me. Blake looked at him for a long moment. Sandra Voss is 40 minutes away, Blake said. Jim Cavallo at the DA's office is making calls right now. This is moving Walter. It's moving fast. Tyler, Walter said. He'll know by now. He checks the shed not because he cares about my comfort. He checks it the way you check on inventory. My men are at the property, Blake said. He's not going back to that shed today. Walter nodded once, then he opened the tin box. He looked at Eleanor's ring for a moment. Then he carefully, with the particular gentleness of a man handling something that belonged to a category beyond price, placed the ring on the table and closed the box and slid it back across to Blake. Keep that safe for me a little longer, Walter said. I don't want to be holding something I'm afraid to lose when the police get here. I need both hands free. Blake picked up the box without a word and put it back in his jacket. Walter, Donna said from behind the counter. They both looked at her. She was not pretending to wipe anything anymore. She was just standing there by her, and her eyes were red at the edges. Can I get you anything, and anything at all? Walter looked at her. And the thing that had been missing from his face since he walked through the door, not this time, but ever across the entire afternoon, finally appeared. Not a polite expression, not a performance. Something real and tired and human. I'd love a piece of pie, Walter Hayes said. If you have it. Eleanor used to say that a man should always eat pie when it's offered because you never know when the next chance comes. Donna laughed. It came out wet at the edges, but it was real. I've got peach and I've got apple. Peach, Walter said. Eleanor preferred peach. Donna nodded and turned away quickly, and Blake noticed that she paused at the kitchen door for just a moment before pushing through it, her hand pressed flat against it, her head down, pulling herself together in the particular private way of people who feel things deeply in public and refuse to show more than the edges. Blake sat back in his chair and looked at Walter Hayes, who sat with his hands on the table and his spine straight and his eyes clear, and who had just in the middle of the most important afternoon of the last 2 years of his life ordered a piece of peach pie because Eleanor preferred peach. 40 minutes later, Sandra Voss walked through the diner door in a dark blazer with a leather briefcase and the expression of a woman who had been turning something large and serious over in her mind for the entire drive and was ready to put it on the table. She shook Blake's hand and then turned to Walter and shook his hand and looked at him directly. Mr. Hayes, she said, I've read your recording. I've seen the photographs from the shed, and I've begun cross-referencing Dr. Ashford's name against county medical and probate records. She sat down and opened her briefcase. I have 4 additional flags that may be connected. 4 patients, 4 caregivers. Ashford's name in the assessment documentation of each one. 2 of those patients are deceased. Walter looked at her. 4 more, he said quietly. Possibly, Sandra said. We're still verifying. But Mr. Hayes, she paused, choosing her next words with the precision of someone who understood that the words a person hears at a turning point stay with them. What you documented in those notebooks is not just your story. It may be the evidence that unravels an operation that has been running for years. You understood what was being done to you well enough to document it clearly enough that we can use it. That is not a small thing. Walter was quiet. Blake watched him process it the way a man processes the moment when the thing he survived turns out to have been bigger than he knew, and he has to decide what to do with that knowledge. Walter looked at Sandra. Jim Cavallo, he said. Blake said he's at the DA's office. He's waiting for my call, Sandra said. Call him, Ichada, Walter said. Sandra looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone who expected to need to prepare a person for something and has found they walked in already prepared. She picked up her phone, and in the yard at 4417 Ridgeline Road, Cage's phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize, which meant Russ had forwarded it from somewhere. The text had 3 words. He's coming back. Cage looked at Decker. Decker was already standing. Tyler Hayes' car had turned onto Ridgeline Road. Cage read the text twice. 3 words. He's coming back. He looked at Decker, and Decker was already moving toward the front gate with the particular economical speed of a man who has been in enough tight situations to stop wasting motion when one arrives. Russ, Cage called out. Russ appeared from the side of the van without needing to be told anything beyond his name. That was Russ. You said his name and he was already there and already thinking. How far out? Decker said. Cage looked at the text again. The timestamp was 40 seconds old. Close, he said. Whoever sent this was watching the road. That had been Hal, a quiet, deeply unremarkable-looking man in his 50s, who had parked his truck at the end of Ridgeline Road when he dropped off the van because Blake had told him to sit there and watch, and Hal did what Blake told him to do without requiring reasons. The three of them moved to the front of the property. Cage put his phone to his ear and called Blake. It rang twice. Tyler's turning onto the property, Cage said when Blake picked up. A half-second pause. Don't let him near the shed. Don't touch him. Don't threaten him. You're guests on private property authorized by the owner. Stay calm and stay between him and the shed. Another half-second. I'm 40 minutes away. Sandra's calling Cavallo right now. Stall. Stall, Cage repeated. Right, how? Talk to him, Blake said. Ask him questions. Men like Tyler love to explain themselves. Give him an audience. The line went quiet. Cage pocketed his phone. Tyler Hayes pulled through the front gate in a dark blue sedan that was clean and recent, the kind of car a responsible professional drives. He was 31 years old, medium height, lean, with the kind of face that photographed well-defined jaw, good teeth, eyes that were a warm shade of brown that probably read as trustworthy on a screen. He was wearing a pressed blue shirt, dark slacks, and he stepped out of the car with the controlled deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed his expression on the drive over and had settled on concerned but reasonable as his opening position. He looked at the three large men standing in his grandfather's front yard, and for just a fraction of a second, so small that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it, his face did something involuntary. A flicker, like a signal crossing a wire too fast to be regulated. Then the composed expression came back, and it was very good. Practiced and natural and warm. Hey, Tyler said, raising one hand in a gesture that was simultaneously a greeting and a demonstration that he was unarmed and unthreatening. His voice was measured, friendly. I don't think we've met. I'm Tyler Hayes. This is my grandfather's property. Can I ask what's going on? Cage stepped forward. He was 26 years old and the youngest at the table, but he had been watching Blake operate long enough to understand the basic principle: stay in front of the thing you're protecting and make the other person come to you. Tyler, Cage said, and matched the warm voice energy completely. Yeah, we're friends of your grandfather's. He asked us to come by and check on a few things. Tyler's eyes moved past Cage toward the side of the house where the shed was and then came back to Cage's face. He asked you to come by, Tyler repeated. The warmth was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted, a fraction of a degree like a thermostat adjusting. Walter asked you, where is he right now? He's comfortable, Cage said. He's been having a real good afternoon. He has dementia, Tyler said, and the word came out smooth and practiced. Like a key he'd used so many times the motion was automatic. He needs supervised care. I'm his designated caregiver. If someone took him somewhere without my authorization, he's 74 years old, Decker said from slightly behind Cage. His voice was flat and factual. Not a child. Tyler turned his gaze to Decker. Something moved behind those warm brown eyes. He reassessed quickly, 3 men patches a van he didn't recognize, and Blake could have told him, had he been there, that Tyler was at his most dangerous right now, not because he was panicking, but because he was adapting. Tyler Hayes had spent 2 years building a story, and he was already in real time looking for the way to extend that story to cover this new development. Look, Tyler said, and his voice dropped into a register that was designed to sound like a man being patient with difficult people. Reasonable man, unreasonable situation. I understand you probably mean well. My grandfather is a very convincing man. He can seem completely lucid and then a few hours later not remember where he is. That's the nature of his condition. I'm not angry at you. I just need to know where he is so I can make sure he's safe. He's safe, Cage said. I need to speak with him, Tyler said. I have a legal right. You have a power of attorney document, Cage said. That's different from a legal right to control a person. The temperature changed. It was subtle. The way Tyler's chin moved very slightly upward. The way his right hand, which had been relaxed at his side, closed partway. He looked at Cage with those warm brown eyes, and for just a moment the warmth had a quality like stage lighting present, functional and fundamentally artificial. "You've done some research," Tyler said. "Your grandfather keeps good notes," Cage said. 3 seconds of silence. A bird somewhere on the property. The distant sound of Route 89. "I'd like you to leave," Tyler said. "This is private property, and I'm asking you to leave." "Walter Hayes owns this property," Decker said. "He authorized our presence. In writing. With a timestamp." Tyler looked at Decker for a long moment, then he looked at the side of the house again. His jaw was tight. The composed expression was still there, but it was working harder now. "The shed," Tyler said quietly. Not to them. To himself. He said it the way a man says a word when he is adding up numbers in his head and has just hit a total he didn't want to reach. He started walking toward the side of the house. Cage moved, not aggressively, not with contact, but he moved into the path and stayed there. And Russ appeared on the other side and Tyler stopped because the geometry of 3 large men is a language that requires no translation. "I need to get to that shed," Tyler said. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone and something underneath it was visible now. Not rage, not fear exactly, but the specific tension of a man watching a structure he built for a long time begin to develop a crack. "There's nothing in that shed that belongs to you," Cage said. "You have no idea." "The notebooks," Cage said quietly. "The floorboard, 3rd from the left." Tyler Hayes went completely still. In 26 years of living, Cage had never seen a person go still the way Tyler went still in that moment. Not frozen from fear, not rigid from anger. Still the way a machine goes still when its power source is interrupted. Every process suspended simultaneously. Then Tyler did something none of them had expected. He laughed. It was short and controlled, and it had absolutely no humor in it. "You found some papers," he said. "The confused notes of a man with declining cognitive function. That's not evidence. That's the sad documentation of a sick man's paranoid ideation." "That's interesting," Cage said, "because the DA's office is using a different word for it." Tyler's laugh stopped. "They're calling it a corroborating record," Cage said. He had no idea if that was the technical term. He was operating on instinct and watching Tyler's face the way Blake had taught him to watch faces not for what they showed, but for what they worked to hide. Across multiple patients, with multiple caregivers, and one doctor. The crack widened. It showed in Tyler's face for exactly 2 seconds before he reassembled it, and in those 2 seconds, Cage saw something he would describe later to Blake as the real Tyler, not the warm-eyed, devoted grandson, not the controlled adapter, but something under all of that, something that was calculating and cold, and had been running these numbers for a long time and had just encountered a total it had no contingency for. "I'm going to call my attorney," Tyler said. "That's your right," Cage said. Tyler pulled out his phone. His hands were steady. Cage gave him that. The hands were steady, and he stepped back toward his car and turned slightly away, and he dialed. Cage pulled out his own phone and texted Blake 2 words. "He knows." Blake was on Route 89 driving fast, and when the text came through, he handed his phone to Hatch, who was riding with him, and said, "Read it." Hatch read it. Blake said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Call Sandra." Sandra Voss was sitting in a booth at Cactus Creek Diner with Walter Hayes, her briefcase open. 3 legal pads covered in her handwriting and arranged in front of her when Blake's call came through. "Tyler's at the property," Blake said. "He knows about the notebooks. He's calling his attorney right now." Sandra processed this in approximately 1 second. "Is he going to run?" "Not yet. He's still performing, but he's close to the edge of what the performance can hold." "Cavallo's already filed for an emergency welfare warrant," Sandra said. "Judge Harmon signed it 20 minutes ago. Law enforcement should be at the property within the hour." She lowered her voice. "Blake, there's something else. While you were driving, I got a call from a woman named Patricia Okafor. She's a retired nurse in Cottonwood. She heard about the Miriam Cole flag through a contact at APL and called me directly." Sandra paused. "She said she filed a complaint 2 years ago about a patient of hers. Elderly man, 77. Caregiver was a young woman. Ashford was the evaluating physician. The man died 8 months ago. His entire estate transferred to the caregiver under a power of attorney that Riley drafted." The diner was quiet enough that Walter, sitting across from Sandra, could hear the shape of the conversation even without words. He watched Sandra's face and read what it meant, and he looked down at the legal pad in front of him and was very still. "That's 3 dead," Blake said. "Minimum," Sandra said. "Cavallo is now treating this as a patterned criminal enterprise. Ashford Riley and at least one other individual they haven't named yet are subjects of the investigation." She paused. "They think Tyler Hayes may have been a recruiter." Blake took that in. A recruiter. Finding the targets. Identifying elderly people with assets and limited family support. Moving in as the caregiver. Bringing in Ashford for the assessment. Riley for the paperwork. Then systematically converting the assets. Sandra's voice was careful and factual. And beneath the factual quality, there was something that was not quite anger, but occupied the same address. Tyler may not have built this system. He may have been brought into it. Blake said nothing for a moment. The truck was moving fast and the afternoon sun was hitting the windshield at an angle that he didn't adjust for. "Who built it?" he said. "That's what Cavallo's working on," Sandra said. "Right now I need you to get back here. Walter needs to hear what I just told you, and I need him to confirm some names from his notebooks against a list Cavallo's team has compiled." 20 minutes, Blake said. He ended the call and drove. At 4417 Ridgeline Road, Tyler Hayes finished his phone call and stood beside his car with the phone in his hand, looking at the ground in front of him. When he looked up, his face had changed again. The composed expression was back, but it had a different quality now, the quality of a decision that has been made. "I'd like to go inside the house," Tyler said. "No," Cage said. "I have belongings inside." "Mr. Hayes's belongings," Cage said, which is a conversation for attorneys and law enforcement. "Law enforcement," Tyler repeated, and something in his voice tested the words, measured them. "You've called the police." "The police have been informed," Cage said carefully. Another silence. The afternoon was moving into early evening and the heat had not diminished. Tyler looked at the side of the house one more time. Then he looked at Cage directly. "You seem like a smart kid," Tyler said, and his voice had dropped back into the warm register, the reasonable register, and it was a remarkable thing to watch the way he could locate that frequency and transmit on it, even now, even here, even with the structure visibly crumbling around him. "Whatever my grandfather told you, I want you to understand that he's been sick for a long time. He believes things that aren't true. He's convinced himself of a narrative that isn't." "Tyler," Cage said. His own voice was quiet, not aggressive, just quiet and direct. "I sat across from your grandfather for 2 hours. I listened to him. And the only thing I can tell you with complete certainty is that the man is not confused about anything." He paused. "I think you know that." Tyler looked at him. "I think you've always known that," Cage said, "which is the part that gets me, because it would be easier to understand if you'd actually believed he was sick. But you knew he wasn't, and you did it anyway, and now you have to live in the same world where the rest of us know that about you." Something happened on Tyler's face that was the most genuine thing Cage had seen from him. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't shame. It was something more primitive than either the expression of a person who has heard an accurate statement about themselves said plainly and out loud, and who has no prepared response for it because no prepared response exists. It lasted 1 second. Then Tyler got in his car. Cage stepped and back and let him. Because Blake had said, "Don't touch him," and Blake was right. And because Tyler driving away from this property right now was not an escape. It was an event on a timeline that was already running. Russ was already texting Hal at the end of the road before Tyler's car had made the turn out of the driveway. Hal watched it pass and typed back the direction it turned. Cage forwarded everything to Sandra, who forwarded it to Cavallo's office, and somewhere across town a phone rang and a duty officer wrote down a description and a direction of travel. Tyler Hayes drove away from 4417 Ridgeline Road, thinking he was choosing the moment to regroup. He didn't know the timeline had already started without him. Blake pulled into the diner parking lot 18 minutes later. He came through the door and went directly to the booth where Sandra and Walter were sitting. He sat down across from them and looked at Walter. "Tyler came to the property," Blake said. "He knows about the notebooks. He drove away. We have his direction of travel with Cavallo's office." Walter nodded. His face was composed in a way that was almost unnerving. Not cold, not numb, but the particular composure of someone who has been expecting each piece of news for a long time and in meeting it as it arrives without surprise. "He'll go to Ashford," Walter said. That's his first call when something goes wrong. I documented that 3 times. Tyler always called Ashford when he was panicking. Sandra looked up from her legal pad. Is that in the notebooks? Page 7, Walter said. Page 11, page 18. Dates, approximate times, and the duration of the calls based on what I could hear through the shed wall. Sandra wrote something on her legal pad and circled it twice. Cavallo needs that right now, she said and picked up her phone. Blake leaned back and looked at Walter Hayes and felt something shift in him that he hadn't expected. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more grounded than that. It was the feeling you get when you see a person who has been tested in a way that would have broken most people and has not broken and has not become bitter or hollow from it, but has instead become something specific and purposeful like metal that has been through heat and come out harder. Walters, Blake said. Sandra told me something on the drive back about Tyler. Walter looked at him. He may not have built this system himself, Blake said. He may have been recruited into it. Walter was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a gesture Blake had learned to recognize as Walter thinking. I considered that, Walter said. In the shed, I had a lot of time to consider things. He set the cup down. There were men who came to the house that I didn't recognize. Not friends, not social visitors. Men who came and spoke quietly with Tyler and left. The names in my notebooks, the ones beside the larger dollar amounts. I always thought Tyler was paying them, but I suppose it could have been the other way. Someone was running the operation, Sandra said, coming off her call with Cavallo. Tyler Ashford, Riley Cavallo's team, believes there's a fourth party, someone who identified the targets, brought in the players, and took the largest share. She looked at Walter. The name Marcus Riley in your notes with the circled question mark and the largest amounts, Cavallo thinks Riley may not have been Tyler's attorney. He may have been management. Walter looked at her for a long moment. He came to the house once, Walter said. Riley, Tyler introduced him as a financial consultant. Very polished, very clean. He shook my hand and called me Mr. Hayes and looked at me with the kind of careful attention that I understand now was assessment. He was deciding how long I had and how much I was worth. Walter's voice was absolutely level. I remember thinking at the time that there was something wrong with his eyes when he smiled. The smile was correct. The eyes were doing something else. What did he look like? Sandra asked Penready. Walter described Riley with the precision of a man who had spent 2 years cultivating the skill of observation because it was the only tool left to him. Tall, 60s, silver hair kept short, a ring on his right hand, not a wedding ring, something with a dark stone signet style. A slight formality to his speech, like someone who had trained out a regional accent. He drove a silver vehicle, American-make, current model year at the time. Sandra wrote it all down and looked at it. That matches the description Cavallo's office already has for a person of interest in 2 separate financial elder abuse cases in Maricopa County. She looked at Blake. They know who this is. They've known about him for 18 months. They haven't been able to build a case because every piece of documentation was too isolated. Each victim appeared to be a separate incident with a separate caregiver. Until Walter's notebooks, Blake said. Until Walter's notebooks, Sandra said. Because Walter documented Riley's visit. Walter documented the payment amounts. Walter documented the names and patterns with enough specificity that Cavallo's team can now connect 4 separate cases to a single organizational structure. She looked at Walter directly. Mr. Hayes, what you did in that shed with a pen and 23 pieces of paper may put 4 people in prison. Walter looked at Sandra Voss. He looked at Blake. He looked at his coffee cup. And when he spoke, his voice had the quality of something that had been said before in private and was now being said out loud for the first time. Eleanor used to say that the most important thing a person can do when something wrong is being done to them is refuse to stop being a witness, Walter said. She was a woman who believed in documentation. Bills, letters, records. She kept everything. He paused. When Tyler locked me in that shed, I had 1 pen and I had the paper from the food labels I peeled off the cans. I tore the labels flat and I wrote on the backs. When I filled those, I found the floorboard. He looked at his hands. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but I kept writing because Eleanor was right. You keep being a witness. Even when there's no audience, you keep the record. The booth was very quiet. Donna had stopped even pretending to do anything nearby. She was standing with her back to the wall and her arms crossed and her eyes wet, and she was not trying to hide it. Blake's phone buzzed. He looked at it, a text from Russ, then another from Cage, then a call from a number he recognized as Cavallo's office. He picked up. "Mr. Mercer," said the voice that was professional and direct and had the quality of someone accustomed to delivering consequential information efficiently. "This is Detective Laura Reyes, Coconino County Sheriff's Office, working with the DA's task force. We have a welfare warrant for Walter Hayes and an arrest warrant for Tyler Hayes. We're requesting Mr. Hayes' current location and asking that he remain there until our officers arrive." "He's here," Blake said. "He's not going anywhere." "We also have units moving to intercept Tyler Hayes' vehicle based on the direction of travel information provided to our office. And we have agents moving on Dr. Raymond Ashford's clinic and residence simultaneously." Blake looked at Walter across the table. "There's one more name," Blake said into the phone. "Marcus Riley. Walter Hayes documented a visit and payment amounts. Sandra Voss has the specifics. She's sitting here right now." A brief pause. "Put her on, please." Blake handed the phone to Sandra. She took it and slid out of the booth and walked to the far end of the diner, speaking in a low, rapid, precise voice, her legal pad in her other hand. Walter watched her go. He looked at Blake. "Is it enough?" Walter asked. "All of it. Is it enough?" Blake looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "It's more than enough." Walter nodded slowly. He looked at his hands on the table, the bruised wrists, the slightly unsteady fingers, the hands of a man who had been reduced systematically and had refused somewhere in the private machinery of himself to be diminished all the way down. "I'm tired," Walter said, not dramatically, not as a complaint, as a plain, true statement from a man who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and could feel for the first time the possibility of setting it down. "I know," Blake said. "I'd like to see Tyler arrested," Walter said. "I don't need to be there. I don't need to watch. I just need someone I trust to tell me when it happens." Blake picked up his phone from the table and set it face up between them. "I'll tell you the minute I hear," he said. Walter looked at the phone. Then he looked at Blake Mercer, this broad-shouldered, gray-templed, scar-jawed man who had pulled out a chair in a diner 4 hours ago for no reason that could be fully explained, except that he looked at an old man's wrists and understood what he was seeing. And the thing that Walter said next was quiet and direct and unadorned, the way Walter said everything that he meant most completely. "I've been asking people for help for 2 years," Walter said. "Neighbors, doctors, county workers, every one of them looked at me and saw what Tyler had arranged for them to see." He paused. "You looked at my wrists." Blake said nothing. "That's all it was," Walter said. "You just looked at the right thing." Outside, the Arizona evening was coming down in shades of orange and copper across Route 89, and somewhere across town, a dark blue sedan was being pulled to the side of the road by 2 county vehicles, and in a clinic on Fort Valley Road, a man in a white coat was answering a knock on his office door that he had not expected, and in a downtown office building, a silver-haired man in his 60s was looking at his phone screen at a series of texts that were not getting any response, and understanding with the precise intelligence of a man who built systems that his system had just stopped working. And in a diner booth in the cooling evening, Walter Hayes was eating a second piece of peach pie that Donna had brought without being asked, because some gestures don't require permission, and Blake Mercer's phone was face up on the table between them waiting. It didn't wait long. At 7:42 in the evening, the text came through from Cavallo's office. Blake picked up the phone, read it, set it back down, and looked at Walter. "Tyler's in custody," he said. Walter set his fork down. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up, and what was on his face was not triumph. It was not relief exactly, though relief was somewhere in it. It was something quieter and more complete than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time to be believed and has finally, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in an Arizona diner, received that gift in full. "Good," Walter Hayes said, and picked his fork back up. The night Tyler Hayes was arrested, Walter slept in a real bed for the first time in 8 months. Sandra Voss had arranged a room at a small hotel 3 miles from the diner, paid for by her firm pending resolution of Walter's estate access, which she was already moving to freeze and restore through emergency legal channels. She drove him there herself, helped him to the door, told him she would be outside the courthouse at 8:30 in the morning, and that he should not speak to anyone, answer any calls from unknown numbers, or open the door for anyone who wasn't her or Blake. Walter listened to all of this with the patient attention of a man receiving a briefing he has earned the right to receive. Then he thanked her. Then he went inside. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Clean sheets, a lamp on the nightstand, a bathroom with a door that locked from the inside, which he did not use because he had spent 8 months behind a locked door, and the inside of his chest still knew the difference. He sat on the edge of the bed and took Eleanor's wedding ring out of his shirt pocket, where he'd moved it after Blake gave it back to him in the diner parking lot. He held it in his palm the way he had been holding things all day: coffee cups, tin boxes, the arms of diner chairs, with the specific, careful grip of a man who has learned that the things worth holding can be taken. "I did it, Elle," he said quietly to the empty room. "I don't know what happens next, but I did the part I could do." He set the ring on the nightstand where he could see it, and then Walter Hayes, 74 years old, bruised and malnourished and absolutely unbroken, lay down on a real mattress, under a real blanket, and slept without a locked door between himself and the rest of the world. The next 3 months moved the way consequential things move, faster than anyone expected and slower than everyone wanted. Cavallo's task force executed simultaneous actions on the morning following Tyler's arrest. Dr. Raymond Ashford was taken into custody at his clinic on Fort Valley Road at 7:15 in the morning. His receptionist later told investigators that Ashford had arrived at the clinic 40 minutes earlier than usual that morning, which suggested he had known something was coming and had gone to the office anyway, either from habit or from a misplaced confidence that his paperwork would hold. It did not hold. The forensic accountants who went through his records found payment trails going back 4 years, to a time before Walter Hayes, before Miriam Cole, before all the names that were accumulating on Cavallo's whiteboard. Marcus Riley was arrested at his home in Scottsdale at 7:40 the same morning. He came to the door in a bathrobe and looked at the detective holding the warrant with an expression that was, by all accounts, completely composed. He asked to see the warrant. He read it. He handed it back. He said, "I'll need to call my attorney." And then he looked past the detective at the 3 additional officers on his front step and the vehicles in his driveway, and he understood, with the intelligence of a man who had built something sophisticated, exactly how thoroughly it had come apart. He said nothing else without his attorney present. His attorney, once retained, took one look at the evidence package and told Marcus Riley privately that the smartest thing he had ever done in his life would be to cooperate fully and immediately, because the documentation against him was not circumstantial. It was chronological, corroborated and written in the handwriting of a man whose cognitive clarity had already been independently verified by 3 separate physicians, none of whom were Raymond Ashford. Tyler Hayes, in a separate facility, had already asked for a deal. The DA's office declined his first offer. They declined his second. On the third, they listened not because Tyler had become sympathetic, but because Tyler knew things about Marcus Riley's operation that Riley's attorney was still trying to negotiate around. And in a situation like that, first complete is first served. What Tyler revealed over 4 hours of recorded testimony was worse than the task force had modeled. Riley had been running the operation for 11 years, not just in Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah. A network of caregivers, some recruited, some coerced, some who believed at least initially that what they were doing was complicated, but not criminal, moving through communities, identifying elderly individuals with assets and limited family support, bringing in a rotating group of complicit medical professionals, using Riley's firm for the documentation, and funneling the extracted assets through a series of shell accounts that had taken forensic accountants 6 weeks to begin untangling. 14 confirmed victims across 4 states, 7 deceased, 2 still living whose situations had not yet come to the attention of anyone positioned to help them. When Sandra Voss relayed the full scope of it to Walter Hayes sitting across from her in her office, with his hands on the table in front of him, Walter was quiet for a long time, long enough that Sandra asked carefully if he was all right. "I'm thinking about Miriam Cole," Walter admitted. "I'm thinking about a 79-year-old woman in Yavapai County who had a neighbor who tried to help her and couldn't. And I'm thinking about the 7 people who died." He looked at Sandra. "Were any of them able to document what was happening to them?" "Not that we've found," Sandra said. Walter nodded. He looked at his hands. "Then I'm going to do something with what I was able to do," he said. "I don't know what yet, but something." The trial opened on a gray Tuesday morning in Flagstaff, 8 months after Walter Hayes walked into Cactus Creek Diner on Route 89. The courtroom was not large, but it was full. Local media had picked up the story in the weeks following the arrests, and then national outlets had followed, drawn by the specific combination of elements that the public mind finds both difficult and necessary to confront: the systematic betrayal of trust, the exploitation of the elderly, the years of invisibility, and the improbable rescue. The Hells Angels angle had gotten its own coverage. Blake Mercer had declined every interview request, which had the predictable effect of making journalists more interested in him, not less. Cage had given one brief comment outside the courthouse at the preliminary hearing, which had been filmed and shared widely. He said simply, "Walter picked the right table." And then he walked away, which turned out to be exactly the kind of statement that people repeated. Walter Hayes took the stand on the fourth day of Tyler's trial. Sandra had prepared him extensively. She had walked him through every question the prosecution would ask, in every direction the defense might try to take him. She had explained more than once that the defense's primary strategy would be to reintroduce doubt about his cognitive capacity, not because they had evidence for it, but because it was the only lever they had left. "They're going to try to confuse you," Sandra told him the morning of his testimony. "They're going to ask questions in a way that seems reasonable and then use your answers to suggest hesitation or uncertainty. Don't rush, don't fill silences, just answer what you know." Walter looked at her across the breakfast table at the hotel where he'd been staying under legal protection. He had put on weight in the 8 months since the diner. His face had color in it. He had started walking in the mornings, a mile first, then 2, his bad leg improving with physical therapy that Sandra's firm had arranged. He looked like a man who had been returned to himself. "Sandra," he said, "I spent 2 years as the only person who knew the truth about what was happening to me. I have spoken that truth into a phone recording, in 23 pages of notes, in 6 hours of recorded testimony for your office, in 2 independent physician evaluations." He picked up his coffee. "I am not confused, and I am not afraid of someone trying to make me seem confused, because I have been watching very carefully for a long time, and I know exactly what that looks like." Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," and that was the end of the preparation conversation. Walter took the stand at 10:15 in the morning. He sat down, adjusted the microphone slightly, and looked at the jury. 12 people. He looked at each of them in turn, the way a man looks at people he is about to trust with something important. Several of them held his gaze. Several looked away. One older woman in the second row, who had white hair and a direct expression, looked back at Walter Hayes with the particular steady attention of someone who has decided to listen with their whole self. Walter noticed her. He would think about her later. The prosecution took him through his account methodically. Eleanor's death, Karen's death, Tyler's arrival, the phone, the bank cards, the license, Ashford, the shed. Walter answered every question in the same measured, precise voice he had used in the diner 8 months ago. He did not perform emotion. He did not editorialize. He gave dates, amounts, names, and details with the accuracy of a man whose documentation had already been verified against financial records and medical files, and proven correct in every measurable particular. The jury watched him. When the prosecutor asked him to describe the shed, Walter described it without inflection. Cot, food shelf, portable toilet, pull cord light. He described the floorboard. He described the pen he'd used, a ballpoint that Tyler had accidentally left in the shed during the first week, which Walter had kept hidden under his mattress because he had understood immediately that it was the most important object in his world. He described peeling the labels off canned goods and writing on the backs. He described the morning he found the loose floorboard and understood what it meant. He described hiding Eleanor's ring. The courtroom was completely silent during this part. The defense took him for cross-examination after lunch. The defense attorney was good. Walter had expected that Tyler would have paid for the best available. His name was Conrad Hale, and he was in his mid-50s with a silver-tongued confidence that came from winning cases other people thought were unwinnable. He approached Walter with the particular respectful warmth of a man who is about to attempt something adversarial and wants his target comfortable before he starts. "Mr. Hayes," Hale began, "you've described an extraordinary experience, and I want to say first that I have complete respect for everything you have been through." "Thank you," Walter said, waited. "You mentioned that you kept notes on food can labels. Would you say that's a typical behavior for someone in your situation?" "I don't know what's typical," Walter said. "I know what I did." "Of course. And these notes, you wrote them from memory. You didn't have access to bank statements directly. I wrote what I could see and what I could hear and what I could deduce from the evidence available to me, Walter said, which is what any person does when they're trying to document something important. Hale smiled. Sure, but memory can be imperfect, can it? Yes, Walter said, which is why I cross-referenced every amount I recorded against the statements I was able to see before my account access was removed. The amounts in my notes match the forensic accountant's findings within a margin of $12 across 17 months. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Hale absorbed it without visible reaction, which was professional of him. Mr. Hayes, Hale said, shifting slightly, isn't it true that you and Tyler had disagreements before he arrived? That your relationship with your grandson was complicated? No, Walter said. Hale paused. He'd expected elaboration. Walter gave none. You had no prior conflicts, Hale pressed. Tyler and I had no significant conflict before he came to stay, Walter said. We had the ordinary distance of a man and his daughter's son who don't live near each other. There was no conflict to resolve, which is why his arrival seemed genuine. It's easier to trust someone you have no reason to distrust. But you distrusted him eventually. I observed him, Walter said, and I documented what I observed. Trust and distrust are conclusions. I gave you the evidence that leads to them and let other people draw their own. Hale tried 4 more angles over the next 40 minutes. He was skilled and persistent, and the questions were genuinely designed to create doubt, to find the edge of a memory that could be made to look soft or uncertain or colored by grievance. He did not find it, because the thing he was up against was not just Walter's memory, it was Walter's documentation, and the documentation had been verified. And a man who has spent 2 years being told he is confused becomes over time extraordinarily precise about the difference between what he knows and what he thinks. The jury saw it. The white-haired woman in the second row had not looked away from Walter Hayes in 40 minutes. When Hale finally said nothing further and sat down, the courtroom exhaled. Walter looked at the jury one more time before stepping down. He did not say anything with his expression. He did not perform relief or vindication. He just looked at them the way he had looked at Blake Mercer across a diner table 8 months ago, directly with the steady eyes of a man who has run out of reasons to look away from anything. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on every major charge against Tyler Hayes: financial fraud, elder abuse, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy. Raymond Ashford was convicted separately of fraud, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy. Marcus Riley, who had cooperated and whose attorney had negotiated fiercely, still received 12 years. The judge's statement at sentencing ran for 40 minutes and included a passage that the court reporter said afterward was the most direct language she had heard from that bench in 19 years. The judge said in part that the victims of this operation had been targeted specifically because the world had decided they were invisible, and that the court's function in this moment was to make clear that the law did not share that decision. Tyler Hayes received 9 years. He did not look at Walter when the verdict was read. Walter looked at him, not with hatred, not with triumph, with the calm, clear attention of a man who has said his piece and knows it was heard. 2 weeks after the verdict, on a Saturday morning in October, when the Arizona heat had finally broken into something approaching bearable, Walter Hayes drove himself to Cactus Creek Diner on Route 89. He had his license back reinstated following the invalidation of Ashford's fraudulent assessment and a clean evaluation from 2 licensed neuropsychologists who had spent a combined 6 hours testing his cognition and found nothing to concern them. He had his bank accounts back. He had his house back, which he had returned to and which he was repainting the kitchen of because Eleanor had always wanted it yellow and he had never gotten around to it. He parked and went inside. Blake's table was the same table, same pushed-together rectangle, same group of men, though today there were 8 of them instead of 6 because word had gotten around within the chapter and nobody had wanted to miss this particular Saturday breakfast. Cage was there, Decker, Russ, Hatch, Fierro, and several others who had heard the story secondhand and felt in the way human beings feel about stories that matter, that they wanted to be present at its continuation. Donna was behind the counter. When she saw Walter come through the door, she pressed her hand to her mouth for just a moment and then composed herself and reached for the coffee pot. Walter did not stop at any other table. He walked directly to Blake's table, and this time he did not ask. He pulled out the empty chair beside Blake and sat down. Blake looked at him and said nothing for a moment, the way he had said nothing that first afternoon, the particular silence that waits rather than pressures. Then Blake put out his hand. Walter shook it. "How's the kitchen coming?" Blake asked. "Slower than I planned," Walter said. "Yellow is harder to get right than I expected." Eleanor would have known exactly which shade. "I'm working from memory." "You'll get it right," Blake said. It was not a platitude. It was a statement of fact from a man who had watched Walter Hayes operate under considerably more difficult conditions. Cage leaned forward across the table. "Walter, there's something we want to ask you about." Walter looked at him. "There's a woman in Prescott," Cage said, 81 years old. "Her son called a domestic violence hotline last week because he doesn't know who else to call. Says her caregiver controls everything, phone, money, medication. Says she's scared, but every time someone official comes to check, the caregiver has an answer for everything." Cage paused. "We thought maybe you'd want to know about it." The table was quiet. Walter looked at Cage for a long moment. Then he looked at Blake. Blake was watching him with an expression that was neutral in that particular way that means a decision has already been made internally and is simply being extended the courtesy of appearing open. "What's her name?" Walter asked. "Ruth," Cage said. "Ruth Medina." Walter nodded slowly. He picked up the coffee cup that Donna had placed in front of him during this exchange because Donna had learned his habits over the months and had not waited to be asked. He wrapped both hands around it. "Tell the son she's not alone," Walter said. "And tell him to document everything. Dates, amounts, names, whatever he can see and hear and deduce from the evidence available." He paused. "Tell him to keep writing, even if he doesn't know who's going to read it. You keep writing." Cage nodded and pulled out his phone. Blake looked at Walter. "You know this doesn't stop with one," he said. "Meaning this is what it becomes now. What happened to you and what you did with it and what that means for the next person." "I know," Walter said. "You sure you're ready for that?" Walter took a sip of his coffee. He thought about Eleanor in a yellow kitchen. He thought about 23 pages of handwriting on the backs of food labels. He thought about a little red tin box and what it meant to hide something you love in the hope that someone with good intentions would eventually find it. He thought about the white-haired woman in the second row of the jury box who had looked at him without looking away for the entire 40 minutes of cross-examination and who had sent a letter to Sandra Voss's office the week after the verdict that Sandra had forwarded to Walter and that he had read 3 times and then folded and put in his shirt pocket next to where the page of notes used to live. The letter said, "I want you to know that I believed you the moment you sat down." "I've been ready," Walter Hayes said. "I was ready when I walked through that door the first time. I just needed somewhere to sit." He set his cup down. Donna appeared with a plate of eggs and toast without being asked, and the table shifted slightly around Walter, not to accommodate him, but because he had already, in the particular way of people who have earned their place by surviving what they survived and choosing what they chose, simply become part of it. Outside, Route 89 ran straight through the Arizona morning, and somewhere on Ridgeline Road a house waited with a kitchen being painted yellow. One careful brushstroke at a time. Some stories don't end with justice. But this one did. And the man at the center of it had made sure of that. Not with power, not with money, not with connections or luck, but with a pen, a loose floorboard, and the absolute refusal to stop being a witness to his own life. That was Walter Hayes. And he had found exactly the right table.